Kamala Harris reportedly plagiarized pages of congressional testimony from a Republican colleague.
This is not good.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Underreported Stories, where I cover the news that CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News fail to report on or don't report on enough. So back in 2007, Kamala was testifying before Congress in favor of a bill that at the time would have created a student loan repayment program for state and local prosecutors. So you become a state or a local prosecutor, you automatically get bought into this student loan repayment program for you since you took out loans to do something, quote, noble. It never passed. When you take a step back and you review Kamala's testimony, it turns out that about 80% of her testimony was taken word for word from the testimony of Republican District Attorney Paul Lagoli of Illinois. So I'm pulling up a picture of Lagoli's testimony versus Harris's testimony side by side. Lagoli's testimony and Harris's testimony, like, it is word for word the same thing. In the first 4 paragraphs, the only thing that differentiates between these two testimonies is the word who versus whom. Lagoli uses the word who, Harris uses the word whom. Other than that, in the listening audience, if you could just see this, it is 4 paragraphs of identical text coupled by 1 inserted paragraph from Harris coupled by exact same testimony back to back. It says, this is what Harris wrote that was different than the other person, than Paul Lagoli. Said public defenders are subject to the same difficulties in retaining attorneys. With starting salaries of about $35,000, new defenders cannot afford to repay their student loans. A little bit more than what Lagoli said, but truly almost word for word. Again, the Free Beacon, who is the organization that put all of this together, they said the main difference between their testimonies is that Lagoli submitted his to the Senate instead of the House. And unlike Harris, Lagoli is a Republican. That is literally the only thing you can see if you're in the viewing audience. If you're in the listening audience, I'm trying my best to describe this for you. These are almost word for word. The orange is the parts that are identical. And again, maybe I should put this on my Instagram story so you guys can see it, because this is just wild. To me, this shows that Kamala really has a lack of attention to detail. She's not really interested in moving the needle forward on something that she's passionate about. She's really just interested in getting the job done. And I don't necessarily think that she acts like that when she is campaigning for something, but I think it does speak wonders about how she acts once she gets into an elected position, because she might look like she's working very hard right now. I think there's evidence to show that you can make that argument. But once she gets into office, it seems like you can look at her 4-year track record as VP, you can look at her track record as a prosecutor, and you can look at her track record in even a small setting like plagiarizing, and you start to notice a pattern of her that she just works really hard to get elected, and once she gets elected, she relies on the people around her to do the bare minimum. Now, I do want to caveat this by saying I would like to give Kamala the benefit of the doubt here, in that I have seen the way that lobbying and nonprofit organizations work when it comes to pushing forward legislation like this. So there very well could have been a nonprofit advocating for this bill that gave Kamala Harris and Paul Lagoli messaging points and a script that they both utilized. But my issue with this is, when you're passionate about something, it should be really easy to write testimony for something you're incredibly passionate about. I think about all the times I've done brand deals, for instance, and of course I can't compare myself to writing testimony for Congress, but I can speak to my own world. And in my own world, I get offered brand deals a lot of the time. And you can tell how passionate I am about a brand based on whether I just use the script or I go forward and I create my own thing. Now, I will say, like, 9 times out of 10, if I'm not passionate about it, I'm not going to get involved in it. But for the most part, what I do is I see a brand and they want to work with me, and I'll say, you know what, I like your scripts and that's great that you do all that work. The truth is, I know my audience, I know what I would be interested in, and I am passionate enough about your project or about the message that I am willing to take on the extra work to be sure that this performs well or this does very well. And so I know what it takes to be passionate about something, and I promise you that copying and pasting script from a nonprofit does not prove that you are passionate about something. So I will leave it at that, but I think that this is quite pathetic, and it is a case for why Kamala Harris is a very apathetic person. But this plagiarism report actually is not limited to one incident. So the Free Beacon went further in depth on their report, and in a separate incident, Kamala Harris actually plagiarized a fictional story about a victim of sex trafficking and then presented it as a real case. She's either ignorant, awful, or dumb, or a combo of the three. It could very well be a combo of the three. The story that Kamala Harris was plagiarizing comes to us from Polaris Project, which is a nonprofit that runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And by June of 2012, the project had posted a series of vignettes, so tiny little graphs or stories that were, quote, representative of the types of calls the hotline receives and really meant for informational purposes. So these were very big generalizations. They were partially fictitious in order to keep the identities and stories of individuals who were the victims of sex trafficking from the internet. According to archived pages, these are, again, meant for informational purposes only. But in November of 2012, that same year that those vignettes went up, Kamala Harris included one of them in a report she published on the state of human trafficking in California. Though she said the story was courtesy of the National Human Trafficking Hotline, she copied it verbatim and did not acknowledge that it contained fictionalized material. So if you are in the viewing audience, you can see that the Polaris Project, which is the vignette that you would see on social media, is mostly orange, and Kamala Harris's campaign website, or her, a report that she published on the state of human trafficking, this is on the right side. They're almost word for word. They are copy and paste minus a couple of, I would say a handful of words. No more than 20 words are changed in this. The only detail Kamala changed was the location of where this awful, tragic case took place. So the Polaris Project actually described a young woman in a vignette. Her name was Kelly. And according to again, we don't know how factual this is. The girl's name is obviously not Kelly, but Kelly, quote unquote, had been forced to engage in prostitution and was rescued by law enforcement in Washington, D.C. But in Kamala Harris's retelling of the story, Kelly had conveniently been found in San Francisco, where Kamala Harris was the district attorney at the time. And the change, really what it did was it gave Kamala Harris credit for a rescue that never occurred. I mean, it did occur. It occurred in Washington, D.C. It did not occur in California, nonetheless, San Francisco. And it's just wild that she tried to take somebody's awful sex trafficking story and turn it into her own. That is wholly unacceptable behavior. I can't think of anything more grotesque than taking and essentially appropriating a story about someone's sex trafficking, a very legitimate story that was changed and altered for the sole purpose of protecting that person's identity, and changing the story to politically fit your narrative. I think it's disgusting. I think Kamala should be held to account for this, and I wish a journalist with any modicum of care for the victims of sex trafficking should ask this question, because that's wild. When I heard this plagiarism story writ large, outside of the actual accusations that are found within them, isn't it so weird how plagiarism accusations keep coming up time and time and time again of Democrats? And more so than answering why I think that's the case, I am just curious about your position, because I see it two ways. Either right-leaning outlets see that plagiarism accusations play really well online, so they're constantly looking for these stories in comparison to the left, or this really is a problem that is endemic among left-leaning politicians and professors. So if you have a take on this, please let me know in the comments. I am dying to hear from you. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked what you heard, please be sure to give this video a thumbs up and leave a comment about how beautiful, stunning, and funny I am. And if you want more content based in logic, be sure to click over here for more videos and clips of my show. If you have the means to financially support the show, consider purchasing from my merch line, Based Apparel, linked right below. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you back here next time. Bye, friends.